Hey cats, what's happening? You know, a little while back I told you I was going to tell you a story about a treasure. I think I'm going to do that today. I'm going to talk about this treasure that still remains undisturbed, unfound. Well, we know where it is. It's still there. I'm going to tell you where it is. The story goes back to the 1700s. In fact, it was probably around 1780 when this happened, and it happened down in a part of southwestern Ohio. Today it's known as Old Town. Now if you look on the map, Old Town is barely a speck on the map. If you blink your eyes, you're going to miss it. It's near Dayton, Ohio. But back then, in the 1700s, much of Ohio wasn't even charted yet or settled, but there was a population of Indians, American Indians, that lived in Ohio. And in this part, southwestern Ohio, was a large village of Shawnee Indian. The village was called Kawagotha, which is now the name, the Indian name, Kawagotha, over the years by the English has been kind of bastardized, and it's now known as Chillicothe. The actual village of Chillicothe, I think, had a couple different locations before its current location right now of Chillicothe, Ohio, but it's not where Old Town is. So the original village was in Old Town. Now, when you think of an Indian village, an American Indian village, what's the first thing that comes to mind? I guess I watch too many westerns because I picture like maybe a dozen teepees, a couple campfires smoldering, some squaws carrying baskets around. No, not in Ohio. In Ohio, the Indians built lodges, or they called them wigglewalls. And if you could imagine, they were very similar to a pole barn construction. Some of these wigglewalls were 2 stories, so they had an upper level, and many of them housed multiple families. Now, if you can imagine a wigglewall that was probably the size of this log house, this is a 2,000 square foot home, so some of these wigglewalls were actually large enough. Pretty close to the same size of our home, which is pretty crazy. But back then, these Indians were pretty crafty. They knew how to build these things, and they knew how to make them withstand the winters, where they could be sheltered and warm, where they could withstand storms. So the other interesting thing about Kawagotha was this Indian village spread out for over a mile. It was huge. I mean, it was like a city, like an Indian city, but large enough that it spread out that far. Now, it was right at the confluence of the Little Miami River and Massey's Creek. And at that point in time, during the 1700s, there was a swamp just a little bit east of that confluence, and right in the middle of that swamp was what they call a black hole. It was just a great big open water right in the middle of the swamp. And then the village was a little bit inland from there. Now, during that time, of course, the English were trying to settle the eastern states, and they were slowly moving westward with their settlements. But if you can imagine, the American Indians had been here for centuries, and their land was being taken by these English, by the whites. And it wasn't always a pretty sight, because the Indians would defend what they had, and they were known to the English as savages. They were called savages because their warfare was pretty savage. And you think of Indians just shooting with bow and arrows. That they did, but they also had muskets that they had traded with the French for many years. They had, you know, a variety of weapons that they could defend themselves with. But they weren't as modern and handy as the United States cavalry. It was in 1870, actually it was August 6th of 1870, that George Rogers Clark, who was leading this cavalry unit, was going to attack Kawagata and destroy the city. Well, Chief Blackhoof of the Shawnee tribe, he was also known as Catahacassus, was his Indian name, Catahacassus, but we just called him Blackhoof. Well, there was also a French trader by the name of Simon Girty. He was a pretty rough and tumble. If you could imagine like a modern day biker back in those days, he was a trader, and he traded with the Indians. So he was a pretty rough and tumble guy, and he was somebody you didn't want to mess with. And he had a relationship with the Shawnee Indian tribe because he traded furs with them and stuff. He's the one that would bring them weapons and things that they needed. Well, he rode into their village and he warned them. He said, just to let you guys know, the United States Cavalry is moving in, and you should really decide what's going to happen here. So the chief got together with his elders, and they decided at that point, if we stay here, we're going to die, because George Rogers Clark was known as Death. He would wipe them out and burn their village to the ground, and they knew that. So they packed up everything they had. They packed up muskets, so spare weapons that they had, tools, pottery, anything that they found of value, kettles, iron kettles, and things that they would use. And a lot of the stuff, if they could, they took hides, large hides, and they wrapped everything and bundled it with rawhide straps as tight as they could, and they wiped it down with bear grease, bear grease was very thick and greasy, and then they double wrapped them again with more hides and put more grease on those. Some of the things they had were silver. Now, it's known that there were silver mines in Ohio or in the area. Nobody really knows exactly where these silver mines were, but the Indians got a lot of silver. In fact, in the village of Kawagata, they probably had around 2 tons of silver. They had, armbands that they made out of silver, bracelets, they made plates, they engraved things. They had the big hoop earrings and the big necklace, fancy silver necklaces, big medallions that they wore, and just big chunks of silver that they had melted down into big wads or big chunks. So they wrapped all these up in those hides and those pelts, and they covered those with the bear grease too. Well, they carried them all out to the edge of the swamp, which was just a little west of the village, near the convergence of Massey Creek and the Little Miami River. It's pretty obvious on the map where that location is. And they made a human chain of the Indians, and they handed the stuff hand over hand, and the last guy was up to his neck at the swamp, and he pitched the stuff out into this black hole where it would sink down in the water. And the idea was they could come back later, somebody would dive down in there and tie some cords around there, and they could pull it back out of the swamp and retrieve their treasures. Well, after everything got thrown in the swamp, the Indians packed up and they burned their village to the ground. They burned their village to the ground, and they took off. A day or two ahead of George Rogers Clark, of course. When George Rogers Clark rode in with his cavalry, all he found was a couple buildings that hadn't burned, and everything else was charred, burned to the ground, just smoldering hot coals. There was nothing left there. There wasn't anything left to pillage or anything. It was gone, and there was no American Indians left there. The Shawnee had moved on and left the premises. As the story goes, the treasure was never recovered by the Shawnee Indians. Now you can look at a map, and I'll show you exactly right where the X is, where the treasure was somewhere in that ballpark was buried, and it's still there today. However, they're guessing that over the years, with the settlement and everything, and probably settled down into the muck of the black hole that it was thrown into, that it could be at least 30 foot below ground level. And then over the years, the swamp slowly dried up, and eventually it was filled over and made into an agricultural field, which you see it is today. It's a cornfield. To go down there and try to dig up this treasure, well, there's a couple issues. First of all, it's private property, so you just can't go in there and dig a hole 30 foot deep to get 2 tons of silver. Number two, the cost involved in trying to locate exactly now you know the general area where the treasure is, or where it was originally described, and there are some actual maps from that time that show where the swamp was, where the river was. But over the years, you know, a river will it'll change. With floods and stuff, it changes a little bit. So there could be some variation to exact location of where the river actually was at that time. So you'd have to do some locating, and depending on how deep it is, it could end up being quite a process. You may have to do some drilling, boring. I don't know if there's any kind of sonar or you know, radar that could go down and find the treasure. And once you did, the cost of excavating it could be pretty costly in itself too. Now, and lastly, the Shawnee Indians still lay claim to that treasure. In other words, it's still theirs, and they consider it sacred. So even if you were to collect that treasure, they would most likely still claim it as their own. The area is still regarded as sacred to the Shawnee Indians, and from time to time they have gone back to that area to hold religious ceremonies, part of their culture. Interesting thing, this was years ago, my brother and I decided we were going to go down there and find the place where this village was and find this treasure. We actually went to Old Town, and we found the where the convergence of the two streams were, and from there we were able to kind of determine exactly where that swamp was, which now, as I said, is just an ag field, an agricultural field. There's nothing there but dirt. And it was pretty cool though, just to stand there and know that at one time in the 1700s, well over 200 years ago, there was a huge American Indian village there, a Shawnee Indian village, and it just kind of had some kind of a spiritual feel to it. It was pretty cool just to stand there and look around, even though it's modernized today. In fact, if you stand in that area and look a little bit to the south, there was a mound or a hill that's covered with trees, and it was thought that that was probably an Indian burial mound. So whether that's true or not, I don't know. So there you go, guys. That's my story of the treasure. Still there? Can you get it? I doubt it. If you did, the Shawnee Indian tribe would still probably lay claim to it. That's all I got for today, guys. So until next time, I will catch you later.